It's Thursday, January 12th, 2022. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with the second installment of the Richard B. Russell Foundation Oral History Project, produced by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm here today in Atlanta, Georgia, with Mr. Charles Campbell. Mr. Campbell earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Georgia and his J.D. from Georgetown University Law Center in 1971. He joined the personal staff of Senator Richard B. Russell in 1966 as legislative assistant, personal aide, and finally administrative assistant, known today as chief of staff. Following Senator Russell's death in 1971, Mr. Campbell stayed on as Senator David Gambrell's interim administrative assistant before returning to Atlanta to practice law at the firm of Heyman and Sizemore. He was later senior member and managing director at Hicks, Maloof and Campbell, and partner at Long, Aldridge and Norman, as well as its successor firm, McKenna Long and Aldridge, now known as Denton's. Regarding the Richard B. Russell Foundation, Mr. Campbell served as a trustee since 1977, including lengthy stints as secretary from 1981 to 1990 and chairman from 1990 to 2007. Charles, thank you so much for having me and also Cheryl Vogt, who's in the other room, packing up papers and books.
Thank you. Glad to have you here.
Really excited to finally sit down and talk about where it all started. So, speaking of where it all started, tell me about your childhood and upbringing. And you grew up in Jackson, Georgia, is that right?
Yeah, well, actually on a farm outside Jackson, about 6 miles from Jackson. My father was county agricultural agent with the Department of Agriculture. And so we had a typical farm life. We had about 100 acres and cattle and so forth. And I was active in the 4-H club. And so we had kind of a typical small town, very satisfactory early life.
So were you from an early age interested in politics and law?
Well, I got interested in law first. When I was in high school, I was on the debate team. And I noticed that I worked at a department store in downtown Jackson where my mother was the bookkeeper. And I worked on the weekends and sometimes in the afternoon after school in the men's clothing department. I noticed that lawyers weren't concerned about how much they were paying for the clothes they bought. So I said, well, maybe being a lawyer would be a good idea. But at any rate, so that was my interest really before I got any interest in politics.
Mm-hmm. So when you were in debate team and you debated at the University of Georgia too, is that what took you to UGA, or was it just the fact that you wanted to be a Georgia Bulldog?
Well, actually, I went my freshman year to Emory University in Atlanta. There was kind of a tradition in Jackson that the top students, if their parents could afford the tuition at Emory, which was very high, and
Sure.
Still is today, they went to Emory. And my parents said if I'd make all A's that they would pay all my expenses. Well, I was pretty naive about how difficult that would be, having come from the public schools in Butts County and competing against people that were far better prepared for college. So I didn't make straight A's. And so after my freshman year, I had to decide, where to transfer. And we had debated the University of Georgia my 1 year at Emory. And they were not nearly as good as Emory, but they were respectable. So I decided to transfer to Georgia. And that cost a fraction as much as Emory, so my parents were excited about that.
I bet. So had your interest in the law continued up through college, and that's what you were being educated for, was hopefully someday to go to law school and become a practicing attorney?
Yeah, I had pretty much decided by the time I was in high school that I wanted to be a trial lawyer. I'll tell you a little story in relationship to that.
Yeah.
On career day when I was a senior, you could go visit the offices of a lawyer or a pharmacist or a government official.
Sure, a career day or
whatever your interest was. Well, they were having a spectacular trial at the Butts County Courthouse. A famous lawyer from Atlanta, Reuben Garland, his brother, Ben Garland, was a lawyer in Jackson, and he had this case, a horrific accident on the interstate that severely injured several local people. So Mr. Garland, Ben Garland, brought in his brother Reuben to help him try the case, and it was real spectacular. And so I went over there every day. That was my career day. They let me take off a week to go to the trial. And so, but by then I was pretty well committed to being a lawyer.
Do you remember if the Garlands won that case?
Yeah, they did. They won the largest personal injury verdict in the history of Butts County to that point in time.
Wow. So what courses did you take at UGA to prepare you for a future career as a trial lawyer?
Well, I majored in political science,
Mm-hmm.
and I took the typical courses, not anything that specifically prepared you for law.
There wasn't a pre-law degree
no,
back then.
No. At least I didn't. My main focus at Georgia was on debate.
Right.
That was my main reason for going to Georgia, was I knew they had a debate team and I could debate. So I was more focused on the debate team, and I was the captain my senior year.
Right.
And I debated 3 years, all of my undergraduate years at Georgia.
So, correct me if I have the story wrong, but you met Senator Russell through Blue Key.
That's correct.
Is that right?
That's correct.
So tell me about how you met him and how you went from Athens, Georgia to Washington, D.C.
Well, in the fall of 1965, I was in graduate school pursuing a master's degree in political science. And I was the assistant debate coach, and I had a teaching assistantship in the political science department. And one of my roommates, Franklin Freeman, was president of Blue Key, the Georgia chapter. And they were having a homecoming banquet, which they had every year, and Senator Russell was getting an award and giving a speech. And so Franklin asked me one day, would you be willing to introduce Senator Russell? And I'd never met him, didn't know anybody in his office. I said I'd be glad to. So I went to the library and did some research. And I discovered he'd been in the Senate since 1933, that he was a very respected and powerful United States senator. But the thing that impressed me the most was that how much money he had brought to Georgia, military bases, Corps of Engineer dams, research laboratories, just the whole communicable disease center in Atlanta. And so I decided to make that the theme of my introduction. And that turned out to be a good decision because I didn't know it at the time. But he was up for re-election the next year in '66, and there were rumors that Georgia's young, progressive, popular governor, Carl Sanders, was going to run against him, and Russell and his advisor were very worried about that. So I got a call the week after the Blue Key banquet and wanted to know if I had any interest in joining the senator's staff in Washington. This was Bill Jordan that called Senator Russell top aide.
Right.
And so I said yes. Now, I thought for a long time that it was my great introduction that got me the job, but Bill Jordan disabused me of that. He said, don't kid yourself. You got you a job because Jasper Dorsey gave you a strong endorsement. So, but at any rate, that's what led to it, and I didn't try to negotiate a position or a salary. The only thing I asked was that I be able to go to law school at night.
Right.
And they agreed to that. So I was admitted at George Washington and Georgetown, and Georgetown was much closer to the capital. So I decided to go to Georgetown and started in September of '66. I joined the staff on January 1, '66.
Right. Now, Senator Russell wasn't your only job offer in D.C. You also had an opportunity to work in Congressman Flint's office. Is that right?
Well, that was actually earlier.
Okay.
When I was in graduate school, Congressman Flint represented my home district and had for years.
Right.
And so he reached out and offered me a job. Well, I was getting ready to go to law school at Georgia, and I wasn't really interested. I didn't tell him flat no. I said, well, I'm inclined to stay here and go to law school, but if I change my mind, I'll let you know.
Right.
And so, and then it turned out after I accepted the job with Senator Russell, after my first day on the job in Washington, somebody from Congressman Flint's office called and accused Senator Russell of stealing his employees. I don't know if it was in joking or not. And so Bill Jordan was the one dealing with it, and so he made him an offer. He said, you can have Campbell if you want him. Well, I wasn't too enthusiastic about that because what would happen if Congressman Flint accepted? But he didn't. He probably knew it was a joke. So I didn't really have a job offer at the same time.
Okay.
It was earlier.
Okay. So your first job was your first job title is technically legislative assistant.
That's right.
But as you say in your memoirs, that was probably a little ambitious of a term for what you
Right.
did in those early days.
I was the first legislative assistant Russell ever had. He'd been in the Senate for over 30 years. And legislative assistants were important positions
Sure.
in the Senate. They
Sure.
advised senators on legislation, wrote legislation, went to the Senate floor and helped senators during debate. Well, I didn't do any of those things. The only thing I did was answer legislative correspondence.
Okay.
Senator Russell did his own work. He had the smallest staff in the Senate, and he really didn't rely much, really any on his staff to advise him about how to vote. That would have been kind of unthinkable.
Right. And I assume nobody on staff was as presumptuous as to assume that you wanted their advice on votes.
That's right. Now, occasionally, in answering correspondence, you'd get carried away. We had a dictation file where Senator Russell had dictated responses on almost every subject. You were
Right.
expected to adhere to that. And if you branched out and kind of expressed yourself, and the letter happened to make it in to Senator Russell, about 20 or 25 letters went in every day. Bill Jordan screened the letters.
Sure.
And you'd get a note back saying, "I like my language better." So
Me too.
preparing legislative mail was not very demanding, shall we say.
Right. Well, eventually you succeed as administrative assistant, chief of staff. I assume, like usual, that would be just running the administrative office, as you said.
Right.
The staff itself, on the personal staff side. And this is where you are tasked with helping to develop the Russell Foundation in its earliest days, in its earliest form. Is that right?
That's right.
So, what was your understanding of what the Russell Foundation was supposed to be? And was that dictated to you by Senator Russell, or were there others?
Well,
how did it work?
Yeah, let me back up a minute.
Sure.
And let me distinguish between what I was told, but have no personal knowledge of, that
Okay.
happened before I got there,
Okay.
and what I participated in after I got there in
Perfect.
January of '66. I was told that in the early 1960s, Dr. O.C. Adderhold, the then president of the University of Georgia, approached Senator Russell about leaving his papers to the UGA library when his Senate service was over. And I was told that Senator Russell was favorably inclined toward it. His only concern was that he didn't want his papers buried in a large university library. He wanted to be sure they were readily available to students, scholars, and researchers. But I was told that he didn't see any particular reason to make an early decision. He was still in relatively good health at that time, although he'd already started, I was told, to suffer from emphysema. But he told Dr. Adderhold, I was informed, that he would think about it and get back in touch with him at an appropriate time. And that's where things stood when I joined the staff. Now, the first discussion I heard of this was in early '69. In early '69, Senator Russell's doctors diagnosed a malignant tumor
Right.
on one of his lungs. And he had cobalt radiation treatment. And this tremendously accentuated his breathing difficulty from emphysema. And it really was a beginning downward spiral. He would die from the effects of emphysema within 2 years.
Right.
The cobalt radiation treatments did eradicate the tumor, but it came at a heavy price. So shortly after the cancer treatment was over, he started talking about what to do with his papers. And I remember him talking to me about it a couple of times. I know he called Senator Talmadge. I think he talked to Jasper Dorsey. He may have talked to others, I don't know. But one of the people I know he talked to was Judge William L. Norton, Jr. of Gainesville. The Norton and Russell families had been close for years. They lived within about 30 miles of each other in northeast Georgia. And when Judge Norton was a young lawyer in the early 1950s, working for the Treasury Department in Washington, his wife Adelaide actually worked in Russell's office. And was one of the volunteers at the Russell for President headquarters in Chicago in 1952 when Russell was seeking the Democratic presidential nomination. So they were very close. Well, based on his conversation with Senator Russell, Judge Norton conducted a study of what other senators had done with their papers, and he discovered that in many instances a private foundation was established. So, based on this study, he prepared a memorandum to Senator Russell and took it over to Winder, I believe in late '69, one weekend when Russell was in Winder. I didn't go with him on that trip because, as I recall, I was undergoing exams in law school. But when he came back the next week, he showed me a copy of Judge Norton's memorandum and proposing what was essentially became the Russell Foundation. And he he showed me a copy or gave me a copy of the memorandum, asked me to read it and tell him what I thought about it, and so I did and told him I thought it seemed to be an ideal solution to his problem. I know he talked to Senator Talmadge. He may have talked to others at that time, but after about 2 weeks, he called Judge Norton and said that he would agree to the establishment of the foundation on 2 conditions. Number 1, no money be raised while he was still in the Senate. And since he died in the Senate, that meant until after he died. And the second one was that Senator Talmadge, his colleague from Georgia in the Senate, agreed to serve as the first chair of the foundation. Now, those 2 conditions were probably related. He never told me this in so many words, but he knew, he was smart enough and experienced enough to know that it wasn't going to be easy to raise a lot of money to honor a dead politician. But he also knew that if anybody could do it, Herman Talmadge could, because he was of vital importance to Georgia's business community at the time. He was chairman of the Agriculture Committee, which Georgia's economy was driven still predominantly by agribusiness at that time. And he was also equally important vice chairman of the Finance Committee. It had broad legislative jurisdiction, tax policy, trade policy, intellectual property, Social Security, Medicare, a whole bunch of things. And not only was he vice chairman, but his best friend in the Senate was Russell Long, who was chairman of the committee. So Senator Talmadge personally raised about over 95% of the money. I think they raised about $1.5 million, as I recall.
Yeah, thereabouts. And most of it from
foundations,
corporate foundations.
And I know that you interviewed Earl Leonard. He probably told you this in the interview, but Earl told me, Earl was press secretary to Senator Russell.
Right.
And left on January 1, '64, before I got there, to join the Government Affairs Department at the Coca-Cola Company. And Earl told me that one day in late '70, after Russell died, late '71 after Russell died, that he got a call from Senator Talmadge. He says, I have an appointment tomorrow with Mr. Woodruff. That was Robert Woodruff, the legendary chairman of the Coca-Cola Company, to see if he'd be willing to make a contribution to the Russell Foundation. He said, when I finish with the meeting, I'll come by your office and let you know how I did. My guess is that Senator Talmadge did that because he knew that Earl would go to Mr. Woodruff and, pave the way, so to speak. But at any rate, Earl said about 2 hours after the time of the appointment, Senator Talmadge appears in his office and said that Mr. Woodruff was very, very, very generous. And the Woodruff Foundation made the largest contribution.
Right.
It was either $500,000 or $250,000, I can't remember. And then there were other foundations. The Campbell Foundation, no kin to me, contributed the next largest, I believe, which was about half the Woodruff Foundation. And then there were others.
Right.
And Senator Talmadge, as chair of the foundation, appointed a fundraising committee chaired by Lawton Calhoun of Savannah. And they raised, and I think Mr. Calhoun got Earl Leonard involved in that, as I recall. And they raised, probably $100,000 or something like that. Senator Talmadge raised the rest of it.
So going through the notes and correspondence in the early days of the foundation, you see a lot, or at least I saw a lot of materials from employees of Cox Broadcasting, Bill Bone, Reinsch, I believe. What role did WSB and Cox Media have in sort of the genesis of the the Russell Foundation?
I'm not aware of any role they had in the genesis of the foundation. Cox Broadcasting had financed through its WSB affiliate in Atlanta a 1-hour documentary on Russell's career,
Right.
called Georgia Giant, that came out in 1970. In fact, I attended the premiere of it at the Washington Hilton Hotel, where President Nixon
That's right.
came, and so Russell knew them. I think that Bill Bone was the secretary of the foundation. I'm not
Yes.
sure he was a trustee.
He was secretary, and at that time, the secretary was not a trustee.
That's right.
Later on, obviously, as you know.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, I read in Gil Fight had an article in Georgia Historical Quarterly, and the Atlanta Constitution had some articles around that time about how the charter members, the charter trustees, were drafted. Was that your responsibility? Were you? I saw that you worked with Senator Talmadge to gather up names, and that the Senator Russell, that is, would approve them. Is that how it went?
My recollection, and you have to bear in mind, I'm 81 years old, and this is something.
81 today.
81
by
today.
the way. Happy birthday.
Thank you. And this is 50 years ago now,
Right.
or over 50, I guess. But my recollection is that Senator Russell was greatly involved in the selection of the original trustees. I know he made it clear to me he wanted a diverse board. For example, he specifically mentioned he wanted young people represented, he wanted women represented, and he wanted African Americans represented. And I'm pretty sure he selected the African American Jesse Hill. And he probably had a role in Wick Knox, who was a young lawyer from Augusta, and Jimmy Blanchard, who was a young lawyer from Columbus. I believe Wick Knox, and maybe Blanchard too, I believe Wick Knox was a Russell intern, if I'm not mistaken. And then the two women were Mrs. Ivan Allen Jr., wife of the Atlanta mayor, and Russell had been friends with him since college.
Oh, okay.
And then Mary Gregory Jewett was head of the Georgia Historic Preservation Group. So I think Russell had a significant role. My recollection is that Senator Talmadge, as the incoming chair, the organizational papers for the foundation were filed in 1970.
Right.
And it actually had its first meeting before Senator Russell died.
Right. That is
in
correct.
70.
Yeah,
Senator,
June of 70.
Senator Talmadge had a major impact on it. I'm pretty sure he suggested Lamar Sizemore, an Atlanta lawyer, who was very close to Talmadge, and he probably suggested quite a few others. But Russell had a significant role in selecting the initial trustees.
Now, you mentioned the first meeting. So the first meeting was June 6, 1970, at Cox Broadcasting headquarters in Atlanta.
That was probably because Bill Bond was the secretary.
Right. So was the senator kept apprised of the foundation's activities while he was alive, or was this something that he wanted set in motion and Senator Talmadge would take care of it and he knew it was in good hands?
He generally knew, when the meeting was taking place, but the truth of the matter is his health was really declining by then.
Right.
He started taking oxygen,
Right.
I believe, prior to that. I remember when we would fly to Winder on an Air Force jet, he had a hard time going up the stairs.
Yeah.
He had to have oxygen, and he started using his hideaway office in the Capitol,
Right.
which was right off the Senate floor, particularly when there were going to be a lot of votes. And he started using a scooter
Right.
that the space agency actually developed, so he could get around. So I don't think that he was in a physical condition as late as the second half of 70, and he entered the hospital for the last time in November of 70 and died on January 21, 71. So I think he was actively involved in the selection of the trustees.
Right.
But after that, I don't think he was as actively involved.
Right. You mentioned him passing away January 21st,
Right.
71. as administrative assistant, would you have been the one overseeing the transfer of his Senate papers and artifacts to the foundation, or would
No,
that have been
that
Mrs. Raisley?
That was done. Let me back up.
I guess the family would have been so Hugh Peterson Jr.
One of Senator Russell's nephews, Hugh Peterson Jr.
Right, that's right.
Was a partner at King and Spalding law firm, which drafted the organizational papers for the. And they also had two lawyers, partners there, Charles Gowan and Robert Trapman Jr., who were among the initial trustees. And I think Senator Talmadge dealt with Hugh Peterson, and then Richard Russell III was a lawyer in Winder, and he was another nephew. He was the other co-executor. And they worked out the agreement.
Okay.
For a while, the papers were stored in a house behind the Russell home in Winder, all except classified stuff and Warren Commission, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
But I think I think Senator Talmadge dealt with the co-executors of the estate. They entered into an agreement to transfer the papers to the foundation.
Right.
And then the foundation would enter into an agreement with the University of Georgia.
Right.
For the housing of them.
Right, with the conveyance
and
documents.
All of this required the approval not only of the foundation, the university, the Board of Regents, and the state legislature. All of them had to approve it. And that was done. I remember Judge Norton's law partner, Bob Cooper, handled it. He was a member of the state legislature. He handled the resolution in the legislature.
So during this period, obviously, we're having this conversation like this is the only thing that's going on in your life at this time. So in '71, your employer, mentor, has passed away. You're still in law school. You're looking for another job. You take another job with Senator Campbell, temporary. What did you stay in touch at all with the foundation, or were you mindful of the senator's legacy, or was this Charles Campbell needs to get on with his life and move on?
Well, to give you a little background on that, at Senator Russell's funeral, Governor Carter spoke, and he told me that he would appreciate me coming by and seeing him before I went back to Washington, which I did the next Monday morning in his office at the state capitol. And he said, I just want you to know that I'm going to appoint, it's not going to be a political appointment to succeed Senator Russell. It's going to be a quality person and so forth. I didn't know David Gambrell at all. And my job in the period immediately after Russell died, there was a provision in the law that the old staff could stay in place for, I think it was 60 days if I'm not mistaken. So they could assemble all the stuff and get it ready for, closing the office. And so I did that for about 30 days. And during that period, I got a call from Senator Gambrell shortly after he was sworn in, wanted to know if I would be willing to stay on as his administrative assistant until I was scheduled to graduate from law school in June of '71. And then he said, and also would you be willing to set up my offices in Georgia and work, kind of as a member of my staff down there until you enter law practice in September. So I agreed to do that. And so I worked for him, I guess, for about 3 months as his administrative assistant. And of course, that was a full-time job.
Sure. Because
he was putting together a new office. So I had almost no contact with the foundation during that period.
When did you reconnect with the Russell Foundation, and how did that come about?
I'll be honest with you, I can't recall having much contact with the Russell Foundation. I'm sure I did have some. And I thought that I was appointed in 1980. I was subsequently told I was appointed in '77.
That's true.
But I'm pretty sure I had on reliable sources that Jasper Dorsey, who became chairman in '78, was responsible for my being named to the board. And then that was in '77, I guess, but a couple of years after he became chairman, the position of secretary became vacant. And Jasper saw to it, I was told, that I got the position of secretary, which paved the way for me to be chairman when he died in 1990.
You've mentioned Jasper Dorsey 2 or 3 times. Tell us who Jasper Dorsey was professionally, but also what role he had in your life and your career.
Well, Jasper was very active in University of Georgia affairs. He was a former chairman of the Alumni Society, or president of the Alumni Society. He was, I first met him when he gave financial support to the University of Georgia debate team. He was the chief lobbyist, I believe, at AT&T in Washington.
Okay.
And he provided the money to build our practice area and so forth and so on. So that's when I first met him. And then he had a son at Georgia named Tucker Dorsey,
Right.
who I was good friends with. He was in Blue Key.
Right.
I was a vice president of Blue Key my senior undergraduate year. And so I was good friends with Tucker. And then a great tragedy occurred just as in the Christmas holidays of '65 when I was going to Washington to join Russell's staff. Not knowing Jasper had any role in my getting the job at that time, Tucker was driving to Washington to be with his family for the holidays and was tragically killed in an automobile accident in North Carolina. And this just devastated Jasper. He was his only son.
Right.
He did have one daughter, Sally Dorsey. But Jasper and I became much closer once I got to Washington. We maybe played golf occasionally. He was a member of a very exclusive country club in Maryland. But we just became very close.
Is that Burning Tree?
No, it wasn't Burning Tree. I've forgotten the name of it now. But it wasn't unusual to see cabinet members or senators or prominent congressmen. That's the wind blowing the fire. So.
We are currently under a severe storm warning here, so
that's great.
But it's a dark and stormy night here in Atlanta, Georgia.
Right.
So, yeah, when you got on the foundation, you would have been on the younger side of the foundation trustees.
Yeah, if it was '77, then I would have been, I guess, 34 years old or thereabouts.
Well, I'm older than that now, so that feels pretty young. So
sounds young to me now.
So now that you're on the foundation and you're taking stock of the foundation's activities, describe what the foundation's primary programs, initiatives, goals were in your early days as a foundation trustee in the late '70s, early '80s.
My main function was serving as secretary.
Right.
At that time, that means I took the minutes at the annual meeting, did whatever Jasper asked me to do. Of course, I had a thriving law practice too. So, and then in '76 I got married. So I had a lot going on.
Right.
And but my activities, I would help Jasper get out the notices of the annual meeting, take the minutes, make the arrangements with the Commerce Club. We always met at the Commerce Club in downtown Atlanta. And I think I became secretary in either '80 or '82, I can't remember. But at any rate, I didn't have a lot. I didn't chair any committees.
Right.
So until I became chairman in 1990, I didn't have a tremendous amount of influence, to be absolutely. My influence was with Jasper.
Okay, so that leads me into my next question, because Mr. Dorsey was chair for so long, especially in your early days. How would you describe how he shepherded the foundation? Whether he sort of was he a consensus builder, or was he someone of very strong personality and said, "We're going to do this"? And
I think he was both. He was a very strong-willed personality, but he'd been the head lobbyist for AT&T in Washington, so he knew how to get along with people.
Right.
And he did that very well. I think to give you a little background on this, Senator Talmadge established the precedent in the first 4 years when he was chair that the foundation, except for special one-time projects, would not spend any year more than the cash income it took in. Mm-hmm. Cash, not appreciation of assets, but cash. And that was primarily dividends and interest. So
Right.
many years it's under $100,000.
Sure.
So the portfolio of the foundation was growing tremendously, because the stock market was thriving in most of those years. Congressman Landrum continued that policy, and Jasper continued it, and I continued it during really the 17 years. So by the time I gave up the chairmanship in 2007, I think they had between $7 and $8 million in, and that's after contributing $3 million to the Special Collections Library.
Right.
While I was chair. But at any rate, the lawyers at Austin Bird that represented the foundation advised them right after I gave up the chairmanship. This is while Dink Neesmith was chairman, I believe.
Okay.
That under the IRS regulations, the Russell Foundation was a private foundation, and it had to distribute at least, I think it was 4%.
Yeah, 4 or 5, I can't remember.
Of the gross value every year. That takes into account unrealized appreciation of stock and other assets. So that kind of doubled, or in some cases tripled, the annual budget. But in the early years, they were very, very conservatively managed. Not to say they weren't even after that, because the portfolio as now is about 6 or 7 million.
Mm-hmm.
So, but there was enough money to do a lot of things while Jasper was chairman, particularly. I don't think well, let me back up. The organizational documents of the foundation said there would be a chair in American history.
Correct.
And
And this
Russell-
is in addition to the chair in political science, which was funded out of Senator Russell's unused 1952 campaign.
That's right. That flowed through his will,
Right.
and
Correct.
that was only about $150,000.
Correct.
The Russell Foundation put $1.3 million in the Russell chair,
Right.
and the organizational documents also provided there would be scholarships. Didn't specify how many or whatever. So those were the two main focuses during the Talmadge and Congressman Landrum 8 years.
This is in addition to the Russell Library.
Oh yeah, the Russell
itself.
Library, absolutely, absolutely. But even the Russell Library wasn't getting a tremendous amount of financial support. I started $25,000 a year,
Right.
but that wasn't done before I became chairman.
Right.
So if you're not going to spend more than your cash income, you got to pay the manager of the portfolio, and your other expenses, then you don't have a heck of a lot to branch out.
Right. I remember reading through the minutes, and this would have been probably in the early 80s. Trustco, as it was known then, it's Truist now after being, all that good stuff, advising the sale of Coca-Cola stock because the foundation's portfolio was overweighted with Coca-Cola stock.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that being the case? And
You remember when that happened?
I could go back and look, but I want to say it was in the early 80s.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean,
Which I'm sure caused some tension with folks who had such close ties to Coca-Cola.
well, you had three lawyers that were partners at King and Spalding
Right.
that represented Trust Company and Coca-Cola.
Right.
The original trustees, as I said earlier, Charlie Guywan and Robert Troutman Jr. And then very shortly after the initial trustee board was organized, Hugh Peterson Jr., the
Right.
nephew and co-executive, was added. So I don't know where that advice came from, but I do remember that it was advised that they probably should at least sell down, not necessarily sell at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it still has some Coca-Cola stock.
Oh, I'm
but
sure. Oh,
not
yeah.
nearly as much as it did.
So, as you mentioned, Mr. Dorsey passed away in 1990. What was the process? What was the transition process from his chairmanship? Because he passed away as chairman. Is that correct?
Yes.
So how was his position? There were obviously vice chairs and things like that. But how did you then move up from secretary to
I think
to
there
chair?
was. I think there was a nominating committee. I don't remember who was on it,
Mm-hmm.
but I remember somebody, and I don't even remember now who it was, came to me and said, Jasper felt like that you should be the chair that succeeded him. Are you willing to do it? And I agreed to. That's my recollection as to how it happened.
One of the first things you did as chair was, and this is according to my research, was appoint a committee that included our friend Norman Underwood, Earl Leonard, and Wick Knox. A three-person committee to evaluate the programs that the foundation had been funding, collect proposals for new programs to fund, and evaluate those in terms of how they fulfilled the foundation's mission. Do you remember that committee and its
Yeah,
findings?
I do generally remember that.
Yeah.
I didn't remember I remember Norman was on it.
Right, he was chair.
But I had had some experience in another nonprofit foundation
Okay.
where, as years went by, it became what you might call stale,
Sure.
and there wasn't much introspection or studying what you were doing.
Just a
and
lot of
what direction you were.
inertia.
Yeah, and the same trustees kept serving year after year after year. So that was one of the reasons I appointed that committee. Actually, also while I was chairman, I put in, or recommended that the foundation adopt, and it did, mandatory emeritus trustees when you got to be 75 years old. And of course, I'm an emeritus trustee now. So I thought the foundation was very successful when I became chairman. The big worry I had when I became chairman was the library started out being the Richard B. Russell Memorial Library.
Right.
Because it was just going to house some of Russell's papers. And then two Georgia congressmen, John Flint and Maston O'Neill, and I think this was in the late 70s while Jasper was chairman. They left their papers when they left the U.S. House of Representatives to the Russell Library. And then Senator Talmadge was defeated in his bid for re-election in 1980, right. And he left his papers. And then Dean Rusk, who was a professor at the UGA School of Law, having served as Secretary of State in both the Kennedy and Johnson administration, left his papers. So it started mushrooming.
Right.
And by the time I became chairman, we had all kinds of collections. I understand there's over 500 now.
That is correct.
So my concern was, and we had a number of congressional collections that were stored off-site and hadn't even been cataloged. And I said, these papers are being attracted here in part using Richard Russell's name. And I became very worried that the facilities were not adequate.
Right.
And there was a new librarian named Bill Potter, had not long before that come to Georgia. So I remember talking to him one day about it, and he said, well, it's interesting you should mention that, because I've been thinking about that too. And he said, I'm going to make a proposal. I believe Chuck Knapp was still president then.
Right.
He said, I'm going to make a proposal that the university build a special collections library building that would house the Russell Library, the Hargret Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and the Peabody Award Archives, which he did. And as I recall, I could be wrong about this, but I believe the feasibility study on it was done while Knapp was still there. And then sometime around 96, I believe, Michael Adams became president.
I think Adams was president from either 96 or 98 to 2013, 2014 when President Moorhead succeeded.
But he was very enthusiastic about the new Special Collections Library building, so it kind of took off after that. And so I said, well, the building was originally going to cost $36 million, 1/3 of which had to be privately donated. So that's $12 million. So I started talking to the Russell trustees. I said, there's nothing we do that's more important than the Russell Library, which is really the whole reason the Russell Foundation was set up in the first place. So I said, what do you think about us using, say, $3 million of our money? Now, that was a lot of money.
Right.
We had about $7 million or so at that point. I said, what do you think about us contributing $3 million to kind of spearhead the private fundraising. So I appointed a committee. The executive committee was enthusiastic about it. I wanted to be sure that if we contributed $3 million, we would still have enough money left to fund all our existing programs. So I asked Trusco to do a study under the most optimistic assumption, under the most reasonable assumption, and under the most pessimistic assumption, and whether we would still have enough money to fund our ongoing programs. And they came back and said, yes, even on the most pessimistic, we would.
Now, that $3 million, with most of these kind of donations, would have been over time. Did the foundation dip into the corpus for that donation? I
could be wrong about that. I believe we contributed all at one time. Yeah, I think we paid $3 million. After I got the results of that study, I was comfortable. The executive committee recommended it to the board, and the board approved it.
Right.
And then it was not long after that the Watson Brown Foundation contributed $3 million.
Right.
And they renamed the Peabody Awards the Watson Brown Peabody Award Archives.
So taking a step back into the recommendations of the foundation and as you said, those sort of ongoing programs that had been central to the foundation, the Russell Chair in American History, there was some controversy over the professor, not Professor Fite, who had retired, but his successor, the late Bill McFeely. And there were.
I hadn't heard that Dr. McFeely died. Did he die?
I believe so. Okay. I believe he did pass away. And if he didn't, I apologize, and we'll make a note on this. Okay. But I believe so. There was some controversy because some member of the foundation didn't believe the professor was living up to sort of the ideals of the professorship. And is that what? Because eventually the foundation stopped funding the chair directly, and that it just became an endowed chair. And it seemed like that you had mentioned President Knapp, that the university proposed that the foundation support the chair at $50,000, and that there be teaching awards, undergraduate teaching awards, that the foundation would also fund.
No, that's not the way it happened.
Okay.
The way it happened, in my recollection, and I don't mind my friend Bill Jordan from some of Russell's staff, he was very anti-McFeely, and he really turned against all of us. But I didn't feel it was appropriate for the Russell Foundation to be telling the University of Georgia what to do about faculty members. And so Bill actually offered a resolution that would have condemned McFeely, and I urged the trustees to vote against it. Well, he didn't even get a second, which upset Bill tremendously. But that was completely different.
Okay.
McFeely left because he was offered the Abraham Baldwin professorship or chair.
Right.
I think it had become uneasy.
Sure.
And Knapp was looking for a way to smoothly, but I made it very clear to Dr. Knapp. I said, you're not going to receive any pressure from the Russell Foundation. And I told him that Bill Jordan didn't even get a second to his motion. So he didn't have to worry about that.
So the university administration was read into the thinking of the foundation.
They made, I said, I don't think it's appropriate for us to be pressuring the university on faculty appointments. But at any rate, he saw fit to give Dr. McFeely the Abraham Baldwin, and then I think that brought in Ed Larson, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And the current chair is Claudio Sant, who's still
right. Now that was totally different from the teaching awards.
Okay. So those were completely unrelated.
Didn't have anything to do with it.
Okay.
The teaching awards came about shortly after I became chairman in 1990. Dr. Knapp, as I recall, said, do you think the Russell Foundation would be willing to establish 3 teaching awards that would recognize excellence in undergraduate teaching in the classroom? Mm-hmm. And I said, I think they would. So I took it up with the executive committee and then the full board, and we established the 3 teaching awards. that had nothing to do with our contribution to the Special Collections Library, had nothing to do with Dr. McFeely. In fact, I believe those awards were established in 1992, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. And I believe McFeely left the chair in 94, I believe.
Yeah.
So,
but those were
right.
those were totally unrelated.
So another major initiative of the foundation during your early years was there was a recommendation to either construct a bust or have some sort of sculpture of the senator in the old Senate office building, the Russell Senate office building up in Washington. So tell me how that went from concept to reality.
Well, the way that came about was in the early years of my law practice, I had a lot of business in Washington because I had a lot of contacts there. Now, slowly, I lost them, and that business kind of evaporated. But in the couple of years after Senator Russell died, I would visit the Russell Senate office building every time I went to Washington. And I'd go by and see Senator Talmadge or Senator Nunn or Scoop Jackson or John Stennis or... and I noticed there were busts in hallways of the Russell Senate office building. There was one of Carl Hayden of Arizona. There was one of Scoop Jackson. But there was no bust of Senator Russell. And then there was a magnificent carving in the stairwell between the second and third floors of the Russell Senate office building. Really magnificent, right up on Russell. But I said, we ought to have a bust. And then that kind of developed into a statue. And I mentioned it to the executive committee, and they were supportive of it. I contacted Senator Nunn's office because I figured it would be tightly regulated to put art in any of the historic buildings on Capitol Hill. Senator Nunn's office put us in touch with the appropriate people in the Senate. They had a committee chaired by the majority leader, and the ranking member was the minority leader of the Senate. I think the majority leader was Bob Dole at that time, as I recall. So they told us that we would have to finance the statue, raise the money for it, that the Senate would have to approve the sculptor and the stone carver and the final work product. And they also told us that the idea was it was going to be a life-size marble statue.
Okay.
On a 4 foot marble pedestal. And they also said, if you put it in the center of the rotunda, which was our idea to start with, the floor will have to be reinforced.
At your expense.
At our expense, and it'd be not only expense, but time delay. Somebody recommended, it may have been Senator Nunn's people, I can't remember, that if you put it in the back of the rotunda, that's already been reinforced because of the walls.
Right.
And you wouldn't have to do that. So that's what we decided to do. And that's where it is located today. Now, once the Russell Foundation agreed to it and we were satisfied we could work with the Senate on the approvals, I appointed a committee of the Russell Foundation. And the first step was to get a sculptor. And we interviewed several. My wife had a friend in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, at either Salem College or Wake Forest, I can't remember. And she recommended Frederick Hart, who was originally from Atlanta, interestingly enough. And further interestingly, his father, who was in television and media, was the media advisor to Senator Estes Kefauver in 1952 when he was seeking the Democratic presidential nomination. And Senator Russell knocked him out of the race by winning the Florida primary. But at any rate, the committee eventually agreed on Frederick Hart. He had a number of public works to his credit. The creation figures at the entrance to the National Cathedral in Washington.
Really?
The soldier figures at the Vietnam War Memorial. A statue of President Carter on the Capitol grounds in Atlanta. So he was well recognized. And he lived in on a farm actually outside a small town in Virginia called Hume, Hume, Virginia. And he had his studio in a pasture there. And so we went out there and we met with him, and were impressed with him, and so we retained him to do the sculptor. He'd never met Russell. He relied exclusively on photographs and film footage.
Okay.
And he prepared a clay model of the statue. And the committee that I'd appointed, we went up several times to his studio and reviewed his progress and so forth. And the only objection we ever made, we didn't like the facial expression. We didn't. I remember Hugh Peterson Jr. was on that committee, and he didn't, and I didn't either, for that matter. So, but he made some changes, and we approved the final product. We're satisfied with it. So then we had to get a sculptor. Well, Frederick Hart had worked with Joseph Palumbo, who was originally from Italy. He was a master stone carver at the National Cathedral. And Rick had worked with him in connection with the creation figures at the entrance to the National Cathedral. So he recommended Palumbo, and we hired him. And the stone carver takes the clay model and does intricate measurements. So
Okay.
he knows down to a hundredths of an inch what the distance between the face and the nose and the size of the ear. So he can then carve out of a block of Italian marble the statue. And it's a precise duplication of the clay model. And that's what happened. Now, of course, we had to raise the money. So, fortunately, Zell Miller was governor of Georgia at the time. And Zell Miller and Senator Nunn agreed to host a fundraising dinner at the governor's mansion in Atlanta. I remember sitting next to Ted Turner at the at the luncheon. We raised about $200,000, primarily from the business community.
Right.
The largest single donation was from the Coca-Cola Company. The second largest was from the family of Ivan Allen. And then we had about another $30,000 or $40,000 we were short, and the Russell Foundation kicked that in. So that paid the sculptor, the stone carver, the dedication ceremony, which was in January of '96,
Right.
and then a reception that was in the historic caucus room of the Russell building, which is where John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy's presidential campaigns were announced, where the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings took place, and where a bunch of other historic events have taken place. So we had the dedication ceremony in January of '96, and Senator Nunn was Master of Ceremonies. That was a presidential election year.
That's right.
And Bill Clinton was running for re-election. He originally, the White House committed that he would speak on Senator Russell's relationship with presidents. But he backed out because of campaign obligations. And his opponent was Bob Dole, the majority leader, and he backed out at the last minute. So we got Vice President Al Gore, whose father, Albert Gore Sr., had served 18 years in the Senate with Russell, to replace President Clinton. And we got, primarily through the efforts of Senator Paul Coverdale, who was a Republican senator from Georgia at the time, we got Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska, who went on to become the longest-serving Republican member of the Senate in the history of the country. And then in addition to that, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who later became majority leader, he gave a wonderful speech. I thought it was the best. All of them were good, but I thought his was just fantastic. And Governor Miller spoke as well on behalf of the state of Georgia.
So this is 1996, and this is tangential to what the Russell Foundation is doing. Excuse me. But around this time and subsequently, there have been efforts to rename the Russell Senate Office Building, or remove the statue or the sculpture, I should say, that the foundation purchased. One movement was led by Dick Gregory, who is a prominent entertainer. And I think most recently, following the death of Senator John McCain, there was sort of a boomlet in interest. What's your thoughts on these sort of campaigns, movements, suggestions about
Well,
renaming the building?
I'm not aware of any serious effort that was made to remove the statue. And I think the Russell Foundation would consider that to be a breach of trust because the Senate approved it and put it there, and we paid for it. But I am aware of about the building, and the most recent one after Senator McCain died, actually, there was a senator from Ohio, Sherrod Brown, I believe, who said and did introduce a resolution to rename the building. This was several years before McCain died. And it didn't even get a committee hearing. When it came up again after Senator McCain died, the Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, said that he would support the resolution. But Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, said he would oppose it and that he was going to appoint a committee. He had become the majority leader by then.
Oh, right, right.
And he said he was going to appoint a committee that was going to study the question. Well, never heard whether he appointed a committee, but if so, nothing happened.
Right.
So it kind of died down. And I guess the country's had more important problems to address since then. So it kind of died a quiet death.
Right. So in 2007, you decide to step down as chair. As you mentioned, Dink Neesmith succeeded you. Did you offer incoming Chairman Neesmith any advice after your 17 years of on-the-job experience about being chair and leading the foundation?
Yeah, I told him that I thought that it was an outstanding board, that I had just put in the provision about emeritus trustees. And I spent a lot of time explaining to him why I thought that was important. I said, you know, and Dink was the first chair of the foundation who didn't work closely with Senator Russell.
Right.
And I said, you're going to be the first of many, because we're going to come to a day when no member of the trustee will have known Senator Russell. And for this foundation to be viable for the long term, we've got to have a committed group of trustees. And remember, the main purpose of the Russell Foundation is to preserve the legacy of Richard Russell. So we're going to have a more diverse board. We're going to have younger people on the board. We're going to have fresh blood with new ideas. And Dink brought into that. And that process, I'm happy to say, has continued under Hugh Peterson. And I think we're bringing on outstanding new fresh blood to the foundation. So I feel very, very good about that. I think the foundation has accomplished far more than Richard Russell could have ever imagined. He would be absolutely astounded at the things that have been done in his name. He would be so pleased. And so I think it has a bright future. And I have never been more optimistic about the future role of the foundation. One thing, when it came up about becoming, that we were a private foundation, the lawyers advised us that we could avoid these restrictions about mandatory distributions if we gave the University of Georgia more control, or really almost total control. And after discussing with the executive committee, it was agreed that the whole purpose, that Judge Norton's whole idea was you'd have an independent foundation.
Right.
And that was the basis that the Russell family gave us the papers. And so we just weren't interested in that. We just lived with the IRS rules, such as they were or might become.
So during your 17 years as chair, you only ever worked directly with one university librarian, Bill Potter, and one director of the Russell Library, Cheryl Vogt.
See, I thought there was another library director, but I may be wrong.
No.
When did Potter come to the university?
87, 88.
Okay, all right, then you're right. You're right.
So tell me about your working relationship with one, Bill Potter, and then Cheryl, who you've continued to work with.
Both of them were excellent. Both of them were excellent. I found Bill very easy to work with. I found him to be very supportive. I can't ever recall a serious source of friction on any level, really. And then, Cheryl Vogt is primarily the one responsible for what the Russell Library has become. She's been there since the beginning. 74, I guess, is when she joined the library? I think it was. She became the acting director in 79.
78.
78, and then the director in 81, I believe. But she's been a godsend, and so she is entitled to the vast amount of the credit for what the Russell Library has become. Not just at the University of Georgia, but its reputation in Georgia as the foremost center for political research, the role the library played in congressional libraries nationwide, and Cheryl served as chair of that group one year. A good indication of how effective Cheryl has been, just one indication, when Robert Caro wrote his books on Lyndon Johnson, his chief researcher was his wife, Anna. And she did a lot of research at the Russell Library.
Right.
And based on her interaction, she nominated Cheryl as the outstanding archivist of the year in the country. And she got that award. So that tells you something about how effective and impressive Cheryl's work has been for the library. And I never had the slightest problem working with Cheryl on any issue at all, money or anything else.
Can you, if you had to name one and describe it, what do you think the greatest accomplishment of the foundation has been to date? So from 1970 to January 12th, 2023.
Well, let me back up a little bit and say that if Senator Russell came back, I think the two things he'd be proudest of is the Rural Scholar Program. And that was established, by the way, after my chairmanship. That was not done while I was chairman. And the Russell Teaching Awards. And I think both of those are fantastic programs. I would say that in terms of Georgia, probably the most important thing the foundation has done is the Russell Library. I think the most important thing the Russell Foundation has done probably nationally is the Russell statue. But, there's been so many great things that was done. The Russell Symposium on National Security.
Oh, right. We didn't even talk about that.
The Leadership UGA program, the debate scholarships, and the other scholarship, the books that have been purchased and distributed free to public and private libraries in Georgia, the Sam Nunn Fellowship, the Washington program.
Washington semester, yeah.
So, it's just been a lot of tremendous things done, but those would be my number one choices.
Is there anything that you can think of where you wish that the foundation had been able to do something that, for whatever reason, it wasn't able to materialize or pull off?
I can't think of a thing, to be honest with you.
Well, how do you think we're here 52, almost 53 years after the foundation was founded? What do you think the future of the foundation is or ought to be in Charles Campbell's opinion?
Well, to be absolutely honest with you, I think the one thing that could adversely affect the work of the foundation and its relationship with the University of Georgia, and by the way, we've had a wonderful partnership with the University of Georgia for over 50 years. And certainly during my 17 years as chair, it was wonderful. I dealt with a number of university presidents, and all of them were very supportive. There have been some rumors, and I don't have personal knowledge of this, so I'm calling it rumors, that there's been some efforts to strip Senator Russell's name from some activities. I was told the teaching awards, I was told the moot court at the law school. That is the greatest danger, because to be very honest with you, and of course it would be up to the foundation trustees at that time, but I think that would be viewed as a breach of faith from the university if that were to happen. Because, again, you got to bear in mind that Russell left his papers there because Dr. Haddo solicited them. for the life of the foundation, the president of the University of Georgia, the head of the libraries, the chancellor of the Board of Regents have been ex officio members, and every president regularly attended. I think Jerry Moorhead has attended more than any other.
I don't believe he's missed one. Not
I
in
mean,
my 5 years.
You know, which is amazing. I think that the foundation has made a special effort to coordinate it with his schedule, but still. And Jerry has been very, very supportive of everything the foundation's done, to my knowledge. But that would be a serious problem, and exactly where that would lead, I don't know. But when you think of all the things that the University of Georgia has Richard Russell's name attached, the Special Collections Building, the moot court in the law school, teaching awards, leadership UGA program, debate scholarships, and I'm sure there are more that I've temporarily forgotten. That's the only real concern I have going forward.
Yeah. On that note, we think back to 1996 with the statue, going back even further, with the Russell name and it being able to attract support and financial support, donations. Do you ever worry that the further we get away from Senator Russell's generation and those who knew Senator Russell, that the Russell name would become more of a drag or a deterrent for
Yeah, I have, and the truth of the matter is, and the civil rights issue is the big issue.
Right, it's the elephant in the room.
He consistently opposed civil rights legislation for two reasons. Number one, he thought that most of these laws were unconstitutional. And number two, he thought that it was left up to the states to decide things like voting standards and public accommodations and so forth, and employment practices. And he thought that for states like Georgia that had large numbers of blacks and whites, the best policy was segregation. Now, he was a segregationist, but he wasn't a racist. And I don't think this is generally known. You know, everything gets painted now with a broad brush. He never brought up the race question a single time over 50 years in public office, from 1921, when he was elected to the Georgia legislature, to 1971, when he died. His opponents tried to use the race question against him, strangely enough. In 1936, when Eugene Talmadge, the only person elected governor of Georgia 4 times, ran against Russell as on the charge that he was a stooge of Franklin Roosevelt. And he was supporting Roosevelt's effort to replace white postmasters with black postmasters and other so forth and so on. Even though he led the longest filibuster against the 1964 Civil Rights Act in the history of the Senate, in his very first public speech in Georgia after President Johnson signed the law, he called on all Georgians to obey the law. He said, "It is our duty as good and patriotic citizens to comply with the law as long as it is on the books, whether we agree with it or not." And the Atlanta newspaper editorialized praise for that position, because many Southern politicians, including some of the senators who participated in this filibuster, were stirring up violence and unrest. So I think if you look at his whole career, civil rights is an important part of it. It shouldn't be swept under the rug. But even if you look at the civil rights issue, and I'm not going to call any names, but I will say that several times during the time I was the chairman of the foundation, a certain Russell trustee said we ought to put on a program on civil rights because people don't know Russell's record and they assume the worst. And I never did support that because I said it's an incendiary thing and it's going to create controversy, and we don't need that. And so, but the truth of the matter is, if you're going to be tarred with the worst assumptions, it may be getting the whole record out is not a bad idea. I've kind of changed my view about that since then. Now, fortunately, I don't have the responsibility now, so I'm free to have whatever thoughts I want. But I think that certainly if you judge his whole career, and don't let civil rights, don't pretend it's the only issue, then I don't think there's any question that he was one of the great senators in the history of the United States Senate. And that's the reason why, and I think it's interesting, when the Senate named the Senate office building for him 1 year after he died, those senators knew him best. They knew his position on civil rights. Hell, they fought him in this filibuster. And they voted 99 to 1 to name the Senate office building for him.
Who was the one?
The one was Philip Hart, and that was an interesting case. Because he didn't do it based on civil rights.
He didn't think they should be naming buildings.
He didn't. He thought it was premature because what happened was they put together a package.
Right.
They were going to name the oldest and most prestigious of the 3 Senate office buildings, what had previously been the old Senate office building,
right,
the Russell building. They were going to name the new Senate office building the Dirksen building, after Everett Dirksen, the Republican from Illinois. And the third building, which was under construction at that time,
right,
the Hart building, after Philip Hart. He had terminal cancer at the time. Mm. And in his speech on the Senate floor, he said, I think it is premature to name these buildings this soon after these people have served. And I know damn well it is for me, who's still here. That was the gist of his,
okay.
But he didn't get a single vote for his.
Well, so you plan to remain active and energetic, an active and energetic member of the Russell Foundation, even in emeritus status?
Well, I don't know how active and energetic I'm going to be, but I'm going to follow Jesse Hill's example. He was one of the original trustees, and when I put in the mandatory emeritus when you're 75, and he was already past 75 at that time, he said, I'm going to continue to serve as an emeritus trustee. So I think that's what I'm going to do.
Well, Charles, thank you so much. Thank you for everything you've done for the Russell Library and the University of Georgia. Chair of the Arches Foundation, the Board of Visitors to the libraries.
Well, I wasn't chair of the Arch Foundation. I was one of the founding trustees, and I served as a trustee, but I was chairman of the investment committee.
Isn't that really the important thing? Well, Charles, thank you again so much. We owe you a debt. I know Cheryl and I do. Even in my short time at the Russell Library, I've incurred a heavy one.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I really do appreciate it. And thank you for your time on this stormy evening in Atlanta. Thank you, sir.
Very good.